evening. Welcome to another of our talks that has been organised by the Centre for Fashion Curation here at London College of Fashion. My name's Amy Delahaye and I'm Joint Director with Judith Clark for the Centre. And we've got our manager Ben Wyman here. And we're completely delighted because we've got Paola di Trocchio from Australia to talk to us this evening about her curated exhibitions, which we're completely delighted to welcome her. Paola is the curator of fashion and textiles at the National Gallery of Victoria, and she's also a highly respected fashion writer. Her interests and skills are incredibly wide-ranging, with her most recent exhibition being 200 Years of Australian Fashion, which was preceded by Edward Steichen and Art Deco fashion, Dior and Yohji Yamamoto, the new look, man style, drape the classical mode, to contemporary dress and remaking fashion. And this evening, we're really pleased because she's going to talk about the processes of curating and how she works. And so she's going to specifically look at the relationship between text, the fashion object, and the museum. And we're really delighted to welcome you, Paola.
Good evening. Thank you all very much for having me. As Amy mentioned, I am a curator at the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia, and I'll be talking about some of my curatorial projects. So the three that will be structuring the presentation are three exhibitions that I have curated over subsequent years. So the first one that I'll be referring to is Edward Steichen and Art Deco fashion, which I curated in 2013 with my colleague, senior curator of photography, Susan Van Wyk. I'll also be talking about Dior and Yamamoto, the new look, as well as 200 Years of Australian Fashion. And I've chosen those three examples because they're all quite different scales. Dior and Yamamoto was quite intimate, Edward Steichen and Art Deco fashion was a little bit bigger, and 200 Years of Australian Fashion was bigger again. All of them followed slightly different methodology, and what I'm looking at in particular is looking at the methodology of reading and writing and the use of text, and particularly fictional or narrative text, as a way of approaching fashion in terms of presentation, as well as interpreting it as a viewer or a visitor. So this actually dovetails in with my PhD research. So I'm actually a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I'm using my curatorial projects as a way of considering this methodology for, in this instance, previous practice, as well as for future practices, as well as, charting it and mapping it as a potential methodology, for further students and for further use. So that's what I'm looking at in my research, and I guess this lecture in some ways is a bit of a way of testing it. I've been doing a lot of reading around it in order to prepare for it, as well as for my study itself, in order to ask how can fashion be read in the museum and how can it be written. These interests have been, part of my practice and my approach over some time. In 2010, I attended the Emerging Writers Festival in Melbourne, which is an event specifically for writers. And as a fashion curator, I came at it from a curatorial perspective, and particularly thinking about the role of writing and what sort of narrative possibilities writing and narrative structures could present in the curatorial process. So I actually wrote a piece called When Objects Talk, and I've just got a little bit of it here in order to give an example of this kind of marrying of narrative structures with curatorial practice. So when you're a curator and someone says the word dialogue, you don't immediately think of words, but objects. In an exhibition, history's objects are treated like characters in a novel or a play, dialogue occurring silently between them. Like the writer, the curator introduces them to each other to see what emerges in their interactions. They meet and greet and chat, have conversations you might predict, and then some you might not. In the gallery, it's their whisperings that drive the exhibition. What results is often a surprise. Castings often begin in the storage environment, the private space of the curator, where objects are kept when they're off display. Like the floor of a teenager's bedroom, items can come into contact in a way that is uncontrived but incidental or practical. Objects occupy the same space because they're made of similar materials, such as fur or leather, or need to be hung on a coat hanger rather than lie flat. Their shared location means that an 18th century morning jacket, woven on a jacquard loom with giant blooms and miniature castles, can accidentally encounter screaming 1960s flower power. This meeting, as it happens, began the National Gallery of Victoria's exhibition, Everlasting, The Flower in Fashion and Textiles, which traced floral motifs in fashion and textiles over 200 years. Even stranger things happen. Progressing through the rows of big blue wardrobes in the storage area one day, I unzipped a cover to find a rail tightly packed with rough cotton dresses. They hung in inconsistent shades of turquoise blue, followed by purple, then pink, then green, then yellow, then cream. These toiles became the main protagonists of an exhibition I called Remaking Fashion. I considered the company, then auditioned for leads. 4 or 5 jostled for the limelight, unquestionably stars. They had form, style, silhouette, and presence. They oozed charisma. They made the cut. The next recruits were harder, more unexpected, slightly reserved with modest qualities. For those, I searched through the rest of the wardrobes, fighting chronology in order to create tension. If you put a 1960s dress next to a 1960s dress, they talk about the 1960s. But if you put a 1960s dress next to a 1990s dress, they'll find something else to talk about. And that's exactly what happened. After a few uninspired introductions and some awkward small talk, conservative 1960s dresses met avant-garde Japanese design. Like strangers at a cocktail party, they were forced to find common ground. So they talked about calico, the fabric of which they were made. The cheap cotton calico was used in the toile for experimentation, for export, to transport design information offshore in the form of an object. They talked about the value of materials and how they were used in design, what is beautiful and what is not, and asked what makes something finished. They got along so well. Sometimes when I write, the same thing happens. Often I know only a little about a character, just the seed or an outline, and only an inkling of another. Then when they meet, they reveal themselves to me by revealing themselves to each other. Each character puts an emotion out, pulls an emotion out in the other, or a history or an experience, and they get to know each other. I get to know them too. With the Victorious Union, I congratulated myself and sought further introductions. However, encounters are not always predictable, and when I proudly brought a deconstructed Dior haute couture to the party, I lost control of the alliance. I was forced to withdraw. There was nothing I could do. The Dior took over. The prima donna triumphed. And so it goes on. So that was just a creative writing piece that I wrote in order to reflect on curatorial practice, I guess, from a literary or a narrative or a fictional perspective, thinking of the objects in the exhibitions as characters and thinking of the concept of dialogue between them. I've looked at other examples, and there's many littered through various texts from Peter McNeill and Sandra Miller's Fashion Writing and Criticism, History, Theory and Practice, where they actually present the origins of critique as grounded in literature. There's James Laver, who writes in Fashion in the Pleasures of Life series about a sort of unhappy marriage between fashion and fiction in the 19th century. And he sort of expresses a disappointment of writers and their inability to describe clothing, particularly in this period, reflecting on Emile Zola in particular, writing, Emile Zola made a fetish of exact description. He could describe a market stall of vegetables or a counter of cheeses with a lyrical tone that few have equalled, but he was not happy in his descriptions of women's dresses. And he's disappointed about this because for James Laver, he sees garments as reflective or illustration of a woman's mind. Diana Vreeland disagrees. She talks about Natasha, when she reads War and Peace. She sees a young... Sorry, the quote is, Natasha in War and Peace. She sees a young lieutenant and follows him into the conservatory and grabs his hand. I know exactly what she's wearing. It's known as the Natasha dress. Where would fashion be without literature? So for Diana Vreeland, she sees it. She needs little description in order for it to be evoked. But she also sort of approaches fashion from quite I guess, filmic or narrative perspective. There's a great reflection by Andre Leontelli in Manolo Blahnik's recent biography, where he talks about working for Diana Vreeland and the fact that in order to prepare a mannequin for her, she describes the character of Cleopatra as being the queen of all Egypt. She's all Egypt. She's the queen. And you know she's a lovely queen, but she's a teenage queen. She's a queen who lives in the sun all day in her garden, and she loves it to have her white peacocks following her around in the garden. And so as a result, Andre Leontelli thinks of this queen who spends all day in the garden. If she's in the garden all day, if she's outside, she's in the sun. And he has this idea to paint the entire mannequin gold. The same gold as the Travis Burton dress that she's going to wear. And where does he get the idea? He gets the idea from Goldfinger. So he's also sort of channeling this narrative, sort of filmic perspective in order to translate Diana Vreeland's interpretation of what she's after. And as a result, she loves it. He described it as she thinks it's the second coming. And they're all incredibly pleased, and they move on to the next project. And Diana Vreeland was an interesting character to look at, I guess, having recently reread her biography. There's many references to her texts in there. And to me, there was a particular passage where she talked about reading and having read fictional books in particular, seriously reading, she calls it, for, I think, 12 years it is. From the time I got married at 18 until the time I went to work in 1937, 12 years I read. And that tends to be the basis of, I guess, her thinking and that kind of theatrical and performative presentations that she puts through in her exhibitions. So these are all just thoughts that have been, I guess, circling around as I've been thinking about the relationship between fashion, literature, and also ways to approach, I guess, fashion, the interpretation of fashion and the presentation of fashion, both as a curator and also, I guess, from an audience perspective. I found that when I curated the exhibition, I was coordinating co-curator for the exhibition The Fashion World of Jean-Paul Gaultier when it travelled to Melbourne. And because we had such vast audiences coming through and because the audiences themselves were generally quite new to the NGV, sometimes there was a bit of a disconnect between an understanding of what people were looking at. Although there was a vast amount of joy, so many people loved the exhibition, for some there was some frustration too, because they were not in the habit of looking at fashion in an art gallery. So I started to think about, I guess, pathways in order for people to be able to understand fashion in the art gallery. And of course, those pathways have existed before. Diana Vreeland's exhibitions, were of course present in the 1970s and onwards. And there's also other, fantastic exhibitions that have taken on, literary frameworks. And two that spring to mind immediately are the Fairy Tales exhibition that was on at the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, where fairy tales were actually the driver of the exhibition, and various fashion design or pieces of fashion designers were related to those particular fairy tales. And also here, the shoes exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I think it was last year, when the curator brought me through, she pointed out the David Beckham shoes and talked about that Cinderella myth the glass slipper and the transformation, the story of rags to riches, and the David Beckham boots actually illustrating that story. So, of course, those narrative frameworks exist in many, many instances. I guess all I'm looking at is pulling them out further and looking at it as a methodology and what potential it continues to offer. So I've completely neglected any visuals, so my apologies. I purposefully kept this one. This relates to the, I guess, narrative piece that I read out, and I guess I specifically took the visuals out because I guess the pleasure of reading is that you evoke the visuals yourself. So this is the wardrobe of the Toiles, starting from blue and moving through to pink, and the various shades. And I have to say what I find fascinating about this image is that to me it was so evocative, I think in 2006 when I first saw it, and now it actually looks quite plain. So it's interesting also how images and interpretations of objects do change over time. And there's a great text by an academic called Patricia Meyer-Spacks, where she actually references rereading, or the actual book is called On Rereading. And that also for me has become an interesting structure for looking at objects and then the representation of objects, because of course in a lot of ways, and thinking about that literary structure, it is a rereading. So you have an object, the object stays the same, but it is the reader who changes, and it is the reader's experiences that change. And often those experiences are shaped by what has happened before and what has happened after. And translating that into an exhibition context, that can be translated from what a viewer has seen before and what a viewer sees after. So often the positioning and the order that actual objects are seen in. But I'm sort of slightly diverging. This wardrobe, I guess, of Toiles ended up being the basis of my MA study, which also translated into the exhibition Remaking Fashion. And then just some fabulous Diana Vreeland to accompany some Diana Vreeland talking. And then also thinking about the exhibition that was at the Palazzo Fortuny, where a lot of those stories and those books that had influenced Diana Vreeland over the years were pulled out as thematic sections, and also the exhibitions that she curated at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So the first project that I'm going to speak about is the exhibition Edward Steichen and Art Deco Fashion. So this exhibition ended up being, in a lot of ways, a rereading of the initial exhibition, which was a touring exhibition called Edward Steichen in High Fashion. So that was an exhibition that was brought together by two external curators, William Ewing and Todd Brandow, and they had access to the Condé Nast archives, which had previously been inaccessible for years. I don't think anyone even knew that they had an entire catalogue of Edward Steichen photography. So they were photography curators. They curated the exhibition as a reflection and a celebration of Edward Steichen's career, and also his exceptional skill with light, and also his early and very modern compositions. So the image of the two models are both wearing poiré, but in 1911 it's a very different way of photographing poiré. I guess when we see poiré in this period, we're used to also seeing illustrations. So this was quite, his technique and his composition was quite groundbreaking. So that ended up being the driver of the show. At the same time, and completely sort of as a separate project, I had been curating an exhibition called Art Deco Fashion. And that was pulled from the collection, so drawing on our repository. So the NGV has a collection of about 8,000 items in its international and Australian collections. And at the time, the Australian and international departments were separate, and I was working in international fashion and textiles. And the exhibition that I was working on was drawn from the collection, and it was tracing the it was much more based around the silhouette, I guess, of the transition of 1920s fashion, which was very two-dimensional, into a three-dimensional form, which was, of course, really anchored on Vionet's bias cut. And it was also tailored and being curated for a very different sort of space. So our permanent fashion and textiles gallery at that time was a very sort of rigid space of 11 cases that were all built in. So there were 2 entrances, and I guess the cases were sort of quite long and narrow. So there wasn't the ability for open display, and there also wasn't the ability to show things in the round, which was also influencing the way that I was curating the exhibition. Because of the very linear cases, I was curating it, I guess, in response to and in acknowledgement of that space, and that's why I was focusing on the two-dimensionality of the 20s dresses, and then the spaces in the middle were going to allow me to show that transition into the more, I guess, sinuous cuts of the 1930s. But because we had these 2 exhibitions happening side by side, and they had very similar, I guess, subject matter in that they were both based in the 20s and 30s, and they both had a fashion angle or element to them, me and Susan got together and decided that we'd like to propose combining them. And that's what we did. And what happened as a result was that the exhibition that I was curating, I guess, adapted itself, or, married with the Edward Steichen exhibition. And as a result, both exhibitions changed in order to, I guess, communicate with each other. So in some ways, well, in a lot of ways, the Edward Steichen in High Fashion exhibition was reread through the Fashion and Textiles collection at the NGV, and conversely, the Fashion and Textiles collection at the NGV was reread through Edward Steichen photography, because it did actually completely alter my selection of fashion and textiles in the exhibition, and it also altered our presentation of the exhibition. So our photographer, Narelle Wilson, I worked very closely with her, and we took a lot of inspiration in our presentation of both in the catalogue and in the exhibition. Well, the exhibition design was done with the exhibition designer, but we all sort of worked together. A lot of the inspiration was actually drawn from the photography itself. So there was this kind of merging of content, each to the other. And then it became quite playful and theatrical in terms of recreating the shadows that Edward Steichen was creating, but also what the fashion allowed the black and white photography was colour, and what the photography allowed the fashion, I guess, was the expression and the presence of an individual. So it was a very, very good pairing. They worked very well together, and I think in some ways it was advantageous not to be representing the actual garments that were in the photography, because that was one of our hesitations very early on, that there could potentially be a sense of disappointment if the pairings weren't exact. But I think in the end, the lack of the exactness of those pairings actually gave a richness to each of them, because I think that sometimes there can be an element of disappointment seeing the exact same garment that is presented in a beautifully crafted photograph, because of course you're always missing the individual. So with a different garment, there was no individual missing. It was just celebrating the garment exactly as it was. And I guess in this particular scenario, it being the only coloured form, it really did pop. And the selection of mannequins was also something that was very particular for this exhibition, and that sort of grey tone worked really well with the black and white colour palette of Edward Steichen's photography. So these are just a few more examples of our photography and the pairing. A Lanvin coat. And then this is one that I was thinking of too, because I actually did discover that this dress, I think, was purchased by a museum in Chicago, and I had looked to borrow it, but in the end decided that the dress that we had in the collection would actually, work well in this scenario and in this pairing. And what was interesting too is that these dresses that most of them were relatively unknown. This one in particular is unlabelled. Through, I guess, the rereading through Edward Steichen's photography, it gives them an extra layer of maybe identity or meaning in that sort of marrying with a character or a figure like Marion Morehouse, who is a prominent figure of the 1920s, and then starts to reflect and inject that garment itself with the profile of a new woman or a modern woman. And then further examples of the photography. And also drawing out, and I think this will come out through in the exhibition installation images, also recreating, I guess, these narratives that are present within the photography of Edward Steichen, and drawing them out in the exhibition design. So racing and attending the races was a fashionable pastime, and then using the narrative that exists in the artwork to then be drawn out and influence the exhibition design. And likewise, that happened with the resort wear, the swimwear. Again, these narratives that are present within the photography in the exhibition in Edward Steichen's work are then drawn out in the exhibition design. So everything, it ended up being quite cyclical. Everything's coming from something, of course. And then the positioning of the models, mannequins, etc. And then even going to the point of recreating the backdrop for this particular piece. And I guess some of it was quite playful. In recreating this backdrop, it started off just with the question of the possibility of could we, and then discovering that we could, and then once we could, it kept going. So this is the exhibition itself. It was on the ground floor. This is the foyer area of the National Gallery of Victoria, which has two campuses. This is our campus for international art. So it came off the foyer. And then this was a Chanel dress that was recently purchased just prior to the exhibition, because I felt that it was important to represent Chanel's little black dress when presenting an exhibition on Art Deco fashion. Oh, sorry, these are the... I didn't realise they're the installation shots because we've still got the things under the mannequin's feet. They're a bit neater. So then using the reflective surfaces as well. And then this is that, I guess, recreated race scene installed in the exhibition. And then through into the next room, because there were two rooms. The first room had a much lower ceiling, so it was much more intimate. And then this was moving into our second room, which was presenting it was sort of roughly divided into 1920s and then 1930s. This was a Callot-Sur, which was a new acquisition. And she was presenting a triumphant entry. And then this was our recreation of evoking the resort wear, but also the importance of resort wear at the time, because, of course, it was a new form of dress, particularly for women. Bathing suits got a lot tighter and a lot snugger because there was the emphasis around movement and the the speed, I guess, that one could achieve in the water with a tighter fitting swimsuit. And Annette Kellerman was actually instrumental in that change in swimwear. She was actually an Australian who was a champion swimmer, and she started off by wearing men's bathing suits to swim because it meant that she could move faster, and then eventually released her own line of swimwear. So the mannequin seated by her pool is wearing an Annette Kellerman swimsuit, and then, of course, the introduction of the pyjama pant, or the palazzo, not the palazzo pyjama, the pyjama, which was used or worn at the beachside by the pool, and then later on as evening wear. We also worked with a milliner in order to create the headpieces. So again, she was drawing those references from the photography itself, as well as creating something quite abstracted. And then these are our bias cut dresses. And then the piano is recurrent in the Edward Steichen photography. So again, drawing on that, the piano was brought into the exhibition design with a mannequin lounging on top. So that was Edward Steichen and Art Deco fashion, an example of, I guess, two exhibitions coming together, but coming together in a rereading of one through the other. So in order to create quite a new presentation. So the next exhibition that I will refer to and talk about is the exhibition Dior and Yamamoto, A New Look. And it started with this particular piece. And I guess thinking back to the piece that I read out earlier by way of introduction, and the idea of dialogue. And of course, dialogue in exhibition is something that has also been explored. I guess the most obvious example is the exhibition that occurred at the Met, I think in 2012, Impossible Conversations, Prada and Schiaparelli. But of course, previous to that, there were precedents, and the precedent that it was drawing on being the Impossible Conversations in the Harper's Bazaar magazines of the 1950s, where, two figures that can't come together do come together. And then there is some actually really beautiful pieces that have been constructed in dialogue, and one that I can think of is the Pamela Goulburn interview that she constructs at the very beginning of the Vionnet catalogue. And it's, again, an imaginary conversation where Vionnet, who, of course, has been passed away for quite some time, presents the responses to Pamela Goulburn's imagined questions. So by collecting the data, or the text and the script that already exists, she's creating a conversation that didn't actually exist. There's another example that was actually presented as a conference paper, I think in 2004, where an impossible conversation was constructed between Miyake and Vionnet in order to, again, reflect on the intersections between their practice and their approach to design. But of course, all this came later because the first instance or encounter with this work, and it's a Yohji Yamamoto jacket and skirt that I was cataloguing when they came into the collection, I think in about 2002. 2002 it was. And they're actually from 2000. And the reason that I've presented them in these sort of conservation-like shots is because I guess this was my encounter with them. It was, the curator in the store cataloguing the new acquisitions, and that's generally how we do it. We lay it on the table, various measurements that you take, record various details, etc. And it was at this time in the store that I first encountered this piece, and I it struck me at that time that there was something about this piece that had a relationship to Dior's new look. And when I was experiencing this, or when I was thinking this, I didn't really take myself seriously. I just kind of thought it and then discarded the thought and let it go. But there was always something about this piece that always struck me as being slightly Dior-esque. And it was only years later, and it actually sort of built, because then I went and saw a Yamamoto show in Paris, I think in 2005, and again this kind of recurrent, there's something Dior-esque about this. But this conflicted with me because Yamamoto had always been talked about being such a, Japanese designer, asymmetrical, anti-Western. There's this kind of, this dichotomy that is established between, who is truly a Western designer like Dior, and, symmetry and structure and, corsets, etc. And Yamamoto, who's, free-flowing, representing different aspects of the female body. Of course, it's not as clear-cut as that. But I guess that's the sort of general structure that is presented around these two designers. So when I was seeing elements of what I thought was Dior in Yamamoto's work, it struck me as a little unusual. But of course, it's there. Body English actually writes about it quite well, particularly in this period of around 2000, a little bit before, a little bit after, where Yamamoto is actually looking at the conventions of haute couture and looking at different designers and in some ways, I guess, deconstructing the traits of what it is that they do. So it's absolutely there. But it sort of took a little while to build, and I guess that's what happens sometimes. Things don't seem obvious straight away, but of course once you work them out, they're incredibly obvious. But that ended up being the basis for the exhibition that I curated in 2013. And what was interesting about this exhibition is that it was the time just after we'd sort of broken out of our structure of this dedicated space for fashion and textiles, which was fantastic. It meant that we had fashion and textiles exhibitions consistently for 10 years, but that stopped being a dedicated space, and it meant that fashion and textiles could exist in all sorts of galleries around the museum. So it meant that exhibitions could be a different size. So it gave me the opportunity to create an exhibition which basically only had 9 works in it. And it was, so this is sort of another kind of Dior-esque piece. And it gave me the opportunity to create a very intimate exhibition, which is something that I hadn't been able to do before because of the structure of the cases. You always needed a particular amount of mannequins in there. And it also gave me the ability to present open display. So what I did was I curated an exhibition where Yamamoto was read through Dior. And of course, Yamamoto has, a broad range of work and range of approaches. So this was just singling out and focusing on one particular element, and also through the objects in our collection. We don't have, vast amounts of Dior. We don't have vast amounts of Yamamoto. But there was a dialogue between the pieces, or selected pieces that created a dialogue between the two. And looking initially at that particular piece that had struck me so profoundly in 2002, and pairing it with a Dior in order to reflect on the similarities of the silhouette, but also where the silhouette deviates, where there is that asymmetry that Yamamoto is so well known for, and I guess that's largely in the peplum. Also, the way that the pieces are patchworked, again, an enormous amount of asymmetry there in comparison to Dior, which is absolutely symmetrical, particularly in that example. Looking at the beautiful Yamamoto hat, which is so like, I've probably got a picture further on, or that the silhouette of that hat that we know so well. from that image of the new look. Referencing that sort of silhouette. Some fashion illustration, which is of the 1950s, again, looking at those silhouettes, and also finding that this particular coat had such a strong synergy with Dior's sort of, Yamamoto's proportions in the grey coat. So the dialogue sort of just, once I started and once I actually recognised that there was this kind of element of Dior in Yamamoto, they just sort of kept unravelling, which is, I guess, a really exciting part of the process, and which is, again, something that is revealed, or an object sometimes reveals itself to you. You might go looking for certain things, but it will tell you something else. And the other, I guess, element of the show, or the aspect of the exhibition, was not just, well, one aspect was looking at the references that Yamamoto makes to Dior. Another element of the exhibition was how groundbreaking and pivotal each of their collections were. So in 1981, when Yamamoto presents his, and alongside Raquel Kubo of Comme des Garçons, presents the deconstructed look, and it is so violently and so startlingly different to anything that's come before, as well as Dior in 1947 when he presents his new look. And it is so startlingly different to anything that's presented before. So looking at both designers as creating those very, very pivotal moments, as well as that reading of Yamamoto through Dior. So this, as I mentioned, it was quite a small exhibition, but presenting it in the round gave the potential for lots of different angles. And those two photographic images were quite important. The use of the Dior new look image, and of course the black dress that's presented in the exhibition is not that exact Dior new look, but I guess it's again reflective of what exists in the collection, and drawing out those stories from what is in the archive itself. And then also the footage of those collections in order to portray and present movement. And then the last example is the exhibition that's on at the moment, 200 Years of Australian Fashion. Sorry. Bit of a tickle. And this was very much presented through the narrative structure of chronology or cause and effect, which, I mean, there were many different, I guess there's many different structures or many different bases that, an exhibition can come about in. And looking at 200 Years of Australian Fashion, of course, it's, there's quite a lot to choose from there. But in my thinking around the exhibition and in my preparation and research, the thing that I kept coming back to was the timeline, which was, literally a timeline that I created, which was sort of, spanned over a length of paper in order to chart the key moments in the history of Australian fashion. Because I guess 200 years of any sort of fashion is a lot. And of course, any exhibition only has, although we have large temporary exhibition galleries, for this exhibition, there's always a limited amount of real estate that you have on offer, so there's always choices and selections that have to be made. And the driver of the exhibition, or the framework that it was based on, was chronology, and also looking at key moments in the history of Australian fashion and key moments that have driven Australian fashion forward. So that's where you get the tensions that I'll talk about as we flick through the slide presentation. But I will just mention this image briefly. This was an image that we created as our marketing campaign image, and it was, in a lot of ways, it was quite playful and quite fun. I worked with a photographer and a creative director, because we wanted to do something quite different, and we also didn't have one image itself that represented or reflected 200 years of Australian fashion. So we constructed it. The team went out to Wilson's Promontory, which is sort of along the coast, in order to take the background shot. And then we spent a day in the studio photographing each of these garments on a mannequin, and then photographing the model posing in the gestures or the form of the mannequin, and then all three images were digitally, glued together. And so what it allows for our marketing and our media department, I guess particularly who are the ones who are the drivers of getting our audiences in, is it gives a face in the marketing campaign. And from an exhibition perspective, it presents that 200-year spectrum of the exhibition. So we actually used it in the introductory phases of the exhibition. So for me, it was important to start with something quite contemporary. I just felt that the exhibition being presented in 2016 should be bookended by 2016. So I wanted a sort of 2016 introduction and a 2016 conclusion. So this ended up being our 2016 introduction, which of course in a museum environment allows us, because of the digital construction, allows us to put garments on a living model, which we wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And then the first section, and this is the first dress, I guess the driver of this particular narrative. This is the earliest known surviving dress made in Australia, and it was worn by the wife of the Governor of New South Wales. So this is a beautiful muslin dress embroidered through with metallic thread. And then, so this created the first section, quite small, as there aren't many surviving garments from this period. But what it does is it takes us up to this dress, which brings us to the gold rush, which this is from 1855. And the gold rush is happening in the 1850s in Victoria, which of course changes the country. Not just Victoria, but brings a lot of, migration in from all over, but chiefly in Victoria. So then the next phase that you get is the development and the emergence of the department store, which is a signifier of the metropolis and the growing city. So the garment in this section that I guess drives that particular narrative is this one here. This is the earliest labelled dress in the collection, and it's from a department store called Brighton Hitchcock. So each of these garments are from different department stores from around the country, and the exhibition design is of a department store or references a department store, and I guess, again, twofold, in order to illustrate the narrative, but also in order to reflect on the different modes for the presentation of fashion at different eras. And then, true to being a department store, there's a millinery section. This isn't just 19th century, but this is bringing us from the earliest hat, which is here, a bonnet from the 19th century, right up to the contemporary period. So this is where I start to talk about a disrupted chronology, because it's not a strict chronology, but chronology becomes the overarching framework. And then dressmakers and tailors is the next section, and it's this dress here that again is the driver of this particular narrative, and that dress is the earliest known labelled garment by an individual. So this is Miss Scott. So following on from Charles Project Worth in the 1860s and the labelling of garments, this comes to Australia, and this is actually a Brisbane maker. So we start to get named individuals. And then just a close-up. We've also got sort of other labelled garments in the section, but also some unknown ones as well. And then the next moment is this is the sort of 30s to 60s period when Paris is the overriding model for fashion and the presentation of fashion and the ideal of fashion. And the piece actually has fallen out of this shot, but it's a coat from 1934 and it's by a maker called Le Louvre, which of course reflects on the fascination with Paris that's beginning. It begins a bit earlier, but in Australia anyway, in the 1920s. And I mean, of course, Paris has always been there, but it's this absolute obsession with Paris, I guess, that is much more pronounced in the early 20th century onwards, with the naming of salons like Le Louvre, which is obviously French, and the person who's owning Le Louvre actually calling the area in which she has her boutique the Paris End. So it's about sort of recreating a mini Paris in Australia at the time. And of course the silhouettes are, what we expect of the 1950s, all very glamorous, and the presentation of fashion is much more intimate. And then it's always great to have a fashion photograph next to your actual example there. So that was a good moment. And then that sort of shift again from the sort of large voluminous silhouettes of the 1950s into short skirts. And this key moment was in 1965 when Jean Shrimpton wears a short dress, to Derby Day, one of the days during the racing season. So that actually creates front page news, and Australians in particular love their mini dresses and apparently are very reluctant to give them up in the 1970s when they fall out of fashion. But this gives an opportunity to reflect or represent different Australian designers from the 1960s, as well as the different sort of facets of the 1960s. So the space age, the sort of hippie movement, flower power, and the sportswear, and also really fun exhibition design, which reflects on that, I guess, flower power theme. And also we spent a lot of time talking about what colours to make these particular mannequins, and in the end we just drew particular colours from the flowers underneath. So there is a sort of unifying element to it as well. The other facet of the 1960s, 70s is the maxi, and of course women wearing trousers, which was, I guess, controversial, from stories of Yves Saint Laurent, to Australia as well. And this piece, I think, is my favourite because it just reflects it all, because not only is she wearing trousers, but she's wearing a see-through sort of blouse to her jumpsuit with strategically placed pockets. And then the absolute explosion in the 1970s of Australiana, and of course that sort of cause and effect, that reaction to the very European influence that we saw before, into the expression of Australian motifs like wattle, native wildlife, etc. And these translate into the designs of Jenny Key and Linda Jackson. And this was a really fun, playful room to put together. The frock salon that they had was called Flamingo Park, and it was inspired by this painting. This is actually a blow-up and reproduction of the painting. The painting itself was probably only about this big, but for, I guess, expressive purposes, the painting was blown up and created the wall feature of the Flamingo Park room. So working with Jenny Key, the designer, this looked nothing like Flamingo Park, the salon, but it didn't bother her at all because it evoked the spirit of Flamingo Park, and I think that's what was the fun of it. We weren't literal, but it was about creating the idea of Flamingo Park. And there they are, looking gorgeous. So art clothes is the next section, which is again, a a reaction to the sort of Flamingo Park movement. Sorry, I'm conscious that I'm keeping you here too long. Oh no, we're okay. So contemporary Australian fashion actually enters the art gallery in 1980. A curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales called Jane de Telliger curates an exhibition called Project 33, and she puts contemporary Australian designers in the art gallery. And now fashion had been in the art gallery previous to that, but it was typically international or historical. So this is quite a big moment for Australian fashion. And you have designers represented like Ruby Brilliant, who is a knitter who thinks of herself as an artist. Wool is just her medium. The body is what she dresses, but her conceptualisation of fashion is around an art discipline or way of thinking. Likewise, Katie Pye actually presents a canvas or a calico outfit, which she paints over and draws over. And here we have a collaboration between Linda Jackson and David McDermott, Linda Jackson being the designer, David McDermott being the artist, who again treats her textiles and her cloth as his canvas. And again, a minimal display, which always makes me laugh because fashion in the art gallery is not minimal at all anymore these days. Well, generally at the moment. But I guess the idea of the art gallery is still white plinths. So the white plinths are presented there. And then the next moment is the Fashion Design Council, which was a body that was founded in 1983 in order to support and nurture young talent. And that went on for about 10 years. So some, great designers have come out of it. Designers with incredibly long careers, designers with, some short careers but some incredible outputs. And one of those is Maureen Fitzgerald, who uses wool and leather to create this piece with great movement in it. And then maybe a more well-known name is Martin Grant, who's designing out of Paris at the moment. So he was part of the FDC, started when he was 17. And the presentation of fashion in the 1980s was on these, sort of wide stage-like platforms, which again informed the exhibition design. So I was very conscious of, we wanted to have a catwalk and a show, but it wasn't going to be long and narrow because that wasn't how fashion was presented in the 1980s. It was, particularly with the FDC, quite a theatrical presentation, very gestural. And the multimedia footage actually presents images or footage of those presentations at the time. So you get the relationship between the models and the mannequins as well as the footage itself. So they're creating quite an atmospheric presentation of 1980s fashion. 1990s is Fashion Weeks with the introduction of Australian Fashion Week and Melbourne Fashion Festival, which do similar things to Fashion Design Council, support and nurture young talent, but they have much more of an international focus, so about either inviting international buyers in or presenting Australian designers on international catwalks. And then our contemporary section represents all different facets of Australian fashion at the moment, from the playful, which is Discount Universe and Romance Was Born, colourful, exuberant, playful, to sort of the much more tailored, with designers like Dion Lee, who's presenting in New York at the moment, Ellery, who's presenting out of Paris, and Louis Hon has also just started presenting out of Paris as well. So this section was really about presenting the diversity of Australian fashion at the moment and giving each individual designer, I guess, their own sort of podium to celebrate their individuality. And then this is Dion Lee, who we commissioned to create a piece as the grand finale. Because as I said before, bookending the exhibition in 2016 was really important because that's when it was presented. So we actually asked him to create a piece specifically for the exhibition and specifically, concluding or made exactly in 2016. And it absolutely was because, he finished it about 2 days before, but we expected no less. That was exactly how it was going to happen. So I mean, it was a great project and exhibition to work on. So hopefully that has introduced you to some exhibitions and some projects that you probably may not have seen before. Some, I guess, thinking around or presentation of thinking behind and around how those exhibitions came together. And I mean, for me, it's really just the beginnings of charting and mapping a framework which I'll continue to explore through further research. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Often we were talking earlier saying how you get to see the books, but you don't often, if you don't see the exhibition, get to actually see the installations. So it was lovely and to hear the stories behind them. We've got some time for 3 or 4 questions, and Ben will walk around with the mic. If anyone
Please make sure you talk into the mic.
Actually, the person whom I would have liked to have engaged has just walked out the door. But it's Professor Judith Clark. Because thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I myself am very interesting in my own university. I'm working on a project on writing fashion writing. And what I understand is that in terms of the fashion writing fashion here, it's held very firmly within the frameworks of chronology. And what I'm interested in is the exhibition that is disruptive, is discordant, is disconnecting. And I was thinking of spectres and hoping to engage. However, everybody else knows about this kind of engagements. And I'm really fascinated by that, and also the particular one at the Met right now, Mana Sex Machinery, which is actually not so much looking at the chronology or maybe the connection between Yamamoto and Dior, or there's definitely Dries Van Noten. There was a connection at Dior, a Dior collection of Dries Van Noten, but in looking at the details of work. And I think, I don't know what way do you see forward in this very complex arena of Britain, Australia, and Europe's and New York's fashion, exhibiting fashion, exhibiting work, exhibiting designers, exhibiting that's forgotten and that disrupts.
Well, I think it's interesting because, I mean, particularly with the increase in fashion exhibitions means that there's an increase of the potential of different ways of presenting them. And, I mean, chronology is, I guess, an obvious structure, and is the structure that I adopted because it was going to be the easiest way to communicate, with a vast audience. But because of the interest, and I think what the interest does is it leads to a much more literate and fashion literate audience. It means that you get to start experimenting with models a lot, with models of presentation a lot more. So I think it's a fascinating time to be working in fashion exhibitions because the potential for them is really there to explore. And I think all these different sort of models of either doing things that are more typical, like chronology, you can still have creativity within that, but also, I guess, thematics or sort of clashes can be really interesting too in the way that they draw out different elements of different designers or different eras or periods even. But yeah, I think there's absolutely a lot of potential there, and it's a really exciting time to be working in this field.
Hi. I would like to ask you about the curatorial approach that you would apply for wider collections such as the V&A fashion collection, the permanent display of fashion, because there is a huge difference in between the temporary exhibitions, which clearly have a narrative and dialogues. But then when it comes to present the permanent collection, it's much more archival. What do you think about that?
I think the interesting thing with fashion is that there's always a temporary element to it because it's light sensitive. So although there are presentations of permanent collections of fashion, and as you say, the V&A is one of them, there is always an element of change because garments can't stay on exhibit for that long. So I guess in some ways every fashion exhibition is a temporary exhibition. But regardless, and I did happen to be at the V&A when they were presenting their permanent exhibition. I did an internship there in 2011, and must have been just before 2012 when they reopened it. There are a lot of decisions that are made around how to present, I guess, that permanent collection and which elements of that permanent collection to pull out and to present and put on display. And I guess in some ways, my experience of that is probably 200 years of Australian fashion, because that's dealing with an archive and a subject matter that spans 200 years. The V&A permanent fashion galleries are longer, but there's still decisions that are made about which particular points in that history and in that collection you do pull out. And I guess every time it's thinking about it again, and history will always keep rewriting itself as well. So in 2016, I have perceived the particular moments that I pulled out to be the moments that have driven Australian fashion forward. But in 20 years' time, those moments might change from another curator's perspective, and also from history's perspective. So it's constantly evolving, and it is great to have the opportunity to work on temporary exhibitions for, limited amounts of time, or predetermined amounts of time in particular spaces. But I guess regardless, even if you are presenting a permanent display, you still have the limitations of the space, the way that it's presented. I guess there's probably just an expectation around the subject matter that might change. But as I mentioned before, there's always a temporary element to fashion and textiles.
Hi, this isn't directly related to content, but I'm just intrigued. Your job sounds absolutely fascinating. How did you get started working in this industry?
So what did I do? I did a BA, Bachelor of Arts, in History and Visual Culture at Monash University, which was a large university in Melbourne. And at the time, I received a scholarship to do it. So I was, obliged as part of the scholarship to maintain distinctions. And then after 3 years, I think I did an honours. And then as part of the honours course, there were sort of 4 components. There was a thesis, two coursework subjects, and an internship. And I did my internship at the National Gallery of Victoria. At the time, I had been doing a lot of subjects I was interested in fashion, and I was interested in art, and I was interested in history. So my lecturer actually placed me at the NGV, recognising that would be something that would be of interest to me. And I have continued on ever since. So I started in a very sort of short-term capacity. I think I was on a 1-month contract, 6-month contract, 2 days a week, 1 day a week, that kind of thing. And over the years, it has grown into a full-time permanent position.
Any other questions?
Hi there. I was just wondering, with sort of technology being incorporated into the Met exhibition, have you considered, and the sort of proliferation of it today,
Was there digital content alongside the exhibition, and have you considered incorporating it into the physical space of it?
We had digital content in 200 Years of Australian Fashion, and that was largely, well, I guess that was twofold. That was either documentary, so talking head. So we interviewed a model from the 1950s in order to kind of evoke the period and the era. We interviewed Linda Jackson and Jenny Key, two designers from the 1970s, in order to get their reflections. And then the other digital content was catwalk footage. Actually, largely it's, and then any other example has been catwalk footage. So there have been other exhibitions I curated an exhibition called Exquisite Threads, co-curated, and in that the digital content was actually really effective because it demonstrated different embroidery stitches. So actually being sort of acted out by a specialist. So that was actually really popular, which we kind of loved seeing everybody fighting over the headphones for. So I guess it's always dependent on the exhibition and dependent on what we feel extra needs to be or can be communicated with the input of digital content. We also had a, what are they called? A multimedia guide for the Fashion World of Jean-Paul Gaultier exhibition, which was basically an audio guide with visuals as well. Not dissimilar. The Barbican had an app. Ours wasn't an app. You could only use it in the space, but not dissimilar to that.
And this is our last question.
It's an honor, thank you. I just wanted to, since this is the last question, return to what you began with about exploring creative writing as a facet of your practice. And I was just interested if When Objects Speak was part of larger research about maybe describing the work of curatorial practice creatively, or if your writing is also focused to generating new exhibition ideas through creative writing.
The piece had sort of come out at the very end of my MA study, so in some ways it was a reaction or a response, a creative response to that. And it is something that I guess I would like to continue to explore, but it always feels like it's sort of hovering around the edges, because I guess my main practice is, you know, physically putting on exhibitions for you know, people to come and visit. So, but it sort of, yeah, it does stay there alongside it.
Well, just say thank you again very, very much.
Thank you.